you. Now I'd like to turn things over to today's moderators. We have Iowa Representative Shannon Lundgren and Minnesota Representative Jennifer Schultz, who will guide us through the rest of today's meeting. Representative Lundgren has been a member of the Iowa House since first being elected in 2016. In addition to chairing the Human Resources Committee there, she sits on the House Health and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee and on the Legislative Council's Health Policy Oversight Committee. She is a co-chair of the Midwestern Legislative Conference's Health and Human Services Committee. Representative Schultz has been a member of the Minnesota House since being elected in 2014. And along with serving as committee chair of the House's Long-Term Care Division, she sits on the House Health and Human Services Finance Division and its Health and Human Services Policy Committee. She is also co-chair of the Midwestern Legislative Conference's Health and Human Services Committee. Thank you, Representative Lundgren and Representative Schultz, for your participation today. And now I'll turn it over to Representative Schultz to introduce today's session's first presenters.
Thank you, John. I want to begin by thanking our presenters for all the work they've done leading up to today's presentation. And I also want to thank the attendees for taking time out of their days to join us for this discussion. If you want to advance the slide, please. So today's meeting will cover these issues. We're going to look at how vaccines are developed and distributed in normal times and what's different about the race to develop vaccines for COVID-19. And we're going to look at how Minnesota is working to prevent and or contain COVID-19 outbreaks in nursing homes and similar settings. And then we'll have time for questions and answers before concluding with a roundtable discussion of what is happening in your respective states or provinces. Advance the slide, please. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce today's first speakers, Sharon Lamperton and James Main. Sharon Lamperton is a registered nurse and Deputy Vice President of State Policy for the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PhRMA. She provides policy analysis and support, clinical expertise, and strategy for myriad industry-related issues, including cost and value of medicines. She previously worked for the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, the GAO, and the National Institutes of Health, among others. James Main is Vice President of Science and Regulatory Advocacy at PhRMA, leading the organization's involvement in numerous science-based public-private partnerships. He has more than 30 years of pharmaceutical industry experience, including contributions to drug discovery research, individual product and portfolio planning and strategy, business development projects and partnerships, development program and clinical trial design, as well as frequent interactions with U.S. and global regulatory agencies. He holds several U.S. and international patents and is an author on over 50 research publications and presentations. So thank you both. So please start us off.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Representative Schultz, and I want to thank you also, Representative Lundgren, and the incredible staff for CSG Midwest in presenting this really exciting webinar. And we appreciate, Jim and I both appreciate being asked to talk about this very important topic. Our industry, PhRMA, which represents 34 different biopharmaceutical companies throughout the United States, has been working at an unprecedented pace. It is one of the most exciting times that I've seen. I've been at PhRMA, registered nurse by training, worked on clinical trials for a large part of my life at National Institutes of Health, but I have never seen the industry collaborate and share information as much as we have over the past 6 months. And it's exciting because all of us, our families, patients throughout the world, are waiting for the hope that I hope that our scientists will be able to bring soon. Jim is very talented. I want to give most of the time to him, so I'm just going to lay the foundation in the early part of the presentation on what our industry collectively is doing, keeping in mind that 34 of our member companies belong to our trade association in DC, and then of course half of our member companies are actively working now to bring a treatment or a cure and a vaccine for COVID. Next slide, please. And some of the ways that we're working, I'll just raise a few. We're working with other life science companies to have new diagnostics. We're rapidly screening the current libraries of medicines that we have just to see what's on the shelf that we could use as potential medicines. We're developing new treatments for those infected using plasmid technology as well as new monoclonal antibodies, and developing a vaccine to prevent future infection. All of these things while talking about manufacturing capabilities so that when, not if, we have that new treatment and that vaccine, how will we get it to those that need it, most vulnerable ones first, and then to the rest of the folks in the world and throughout our country. So how are we going to do that? We've been working with scientists and collaborating. This is really not, our industry is typically competitive. We're working and challenging each other, but this is a different time indeed. We're working together with other countries, with other biopharma companies that aren't even in our trade association, academia, and as well as our FDA, CDC, and other agencies. In our next slide, we'll look at some of those responses I just touched on, bringing diagnostics, looking at existing medicines, vaccines. How do we ramp up that manufacturing? Some of our companies are already dedicating space in manufacturing facilities, even before an approval. That's how dedicated they are in making sure that when we have that treatment approved or that vaccine, we'll be able to ramp it up and get it out quickly. And then finally, looking at new treatments. The next slide has the most promising, I think, of our slide deck, which shows that 1,530 clinical trials are underway right now for vaccinations and treatment around the coronavirus. 81 of those are investigative vaccines and the rest being therapies. But how exciting is that we know that that's throughout the country. A good portion of that is occurring here in the United States as well. I have a breakdown if you're interested offline for what's occurring in your states so that we can be of assistance to the legislators who want to drill down exactly where in their states are these clinical trials occurring. And the next slide, before I hand it over to Jim, shows how challenging it is. We know that with each medicine that it takes to bring from bench to bedside, we have 88% failure rate. That means only 12% succeed. About 2.6 billion to start and bring that drug to market. And yet we have 88% failure. Unfortunately, with vaccinations, we have an even greater failure rate. Only 5 to 10% are likely to succeed. That's why we need as many shots on goal so that we can be successful. So this is showing that indeed, early in 2003, when we had SARS, certainly not as egregious as what we're seeing here with our COVID virus, but SARS, it took 20 months to sequence that virus and for the first human study of a vaccine. And then today, within 4 months, we had the first COVID human study. So we have built and have a strong foundation of innovation. Had we not had that in place, we would never have been ready to deploy as many clinical trials as we've done since the pandemic has been declared. And then my final slide before handing it over to Jim is showing you a little smattering of how many of those clinical trials are occurring in our country. You're seeing that it's in 46 states. There are 338 clinical trials, and of those being conducted, I can drill down further, but I want to give the rest of the time to Jim, who's going to talk more about vaccines and the development and the life cycle of vaccines. Jim.
Thanks, Sharon. If I can have the next slide. And I'll try to provide a few comments here to build on some of the concepts that Sharon and others have introduced. And moving quickly through these slides so that we have plenty of time for question and answer. Next slide. So how are vaccines identified and developed anyway? My training, just a little bit about me, my training and background is in pharmacology and toxicology. So the first two questions I ask whenever I encounter a new medicine or a new treatment is, how does it work, the pharmacology, and is it safe, the toxicology? So we'll go through those concepts as we talk about vaccines. How do they work and are they safe? A vaccine is a biologic product. And that's first thing we want to understand is that these are complex biological medicines. They are difficult to produce and they are difficult to control in terms of the way they're manufactured. It contains an element called an agent here that is typically a protein that is derived from or taken from the microbe that you're trying to vaccine against. We have vaccines against both bacteria and viruses. All of them are active because they present an antigen or a protein fragment from that, that infectious agent to a host, to a person, and allowing that person's immune system to respond to that exposure to that antigen. The nice thing about that is that you don't have to expose the host or the person to the full virus or the full bacteria in order to get an immune system response. So you'll see as we get into some of the more details around how these work, that there's all sorts of clever ways to extract and present just that signaling antigen to the immune system in a way that allows the immune system to mount a response and create immunity. So it begs the question then, why not? And I've had this, actually had this during a congressional committee briefing not too many weeks ago. Why not just let herd immunity take over? Why not just let this run its course and let the population build immunity? We've seen with this virus in particular that it is a nasty virus. It is highly communicable. It is lethal at a level that is much more frequent than other viruses that we've encountered recently. And it is the type of virus that has two others of the five things that can be bad about a virus. This has four, and the other two are it persists in the atmosphere and on surfaces, so it doesn't disappear as soon as it leaves a host like some viruses do. It persists and can be transferred in that way. And the last thing is that patients who are infectious, who can be a source of infection, don't always know that they have the disease. So those are four of the five bad things that viruses can have, and this one it fits the category. So not a good virus, not one that we want to let run loose in the population, and one where we very desperately need both treatments and controls. And vaccines are in the control category. Next slide. So what's the value proposition for vaccines? And I think this is one thing that we can say without any doubt or uncertainty whatsoever, is that vaccines are a tremendous tool, perhaps the most important medical advance in the 20th century. The creation of vaccines has prevented 500 million illnesses in the US, has prevented tens of millions of hospitalizations, has helped to avoid estimated 1 million deaths in the US over the past 20 years, and saves the economy, importantly, trillions and trillions of dollars. So I won't dwell on this slide, but I want folks to remember that the value proposition for vaccines, the benefit versus the cost, the benefit versus the risk, is really high. It's as high as anything we have in medicine or in economics. Next slide, please. All right, let's get into vaccine development then a little bit. So how do these things go from a good idea to becoming a product that patients can access? As Sharon said, it typically takes 10 to 15 years to bring a vaccine to the marketplace. As you can see here, some familiar examples, HPV, measles, polio, and they all are in that 10, 15-year range. And up at the top of the figure is the coronavirus. And coronavirus, we're estimating about 1.5 years. So how is that possible? And if it's shrinking by a factor of 10 relative to papillomavirus vaccines, then all right, what's going on? Are you cutting corners? And where are those corners being cut? So next slide, please. So I'm here to tell you, with 31 years of developing drugs in the pharmaceutical industry, that I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen anything like this. Drug development, research and development is largely a very structured and highly regulated process. And because of that, it doesn't tolerate a lot of variation, and it doesn't tolerate a lot of differences in how things are developed. So the pathway for development of a vaccine that has evolved over time assures the delivery of a high quality, safe, and effective product in a reasonable time frame. And that's the figure on the top. 8 to 10 years to go from a preclinical vaccine that can be tested to see if it's going to be acceptable for use in clinical studies, through the clinical studies themselves, through the licensing process with regulators in the US and elsewhere, and then through the decision-making process for how it's going to be distributed and used in the marketplace. So what's different this time around? Why is this not also 8 to 10 years? Well, it's largely because we've been able to shrink the front end and the back end of the process. And by that I mean, as Sharon mentioned, what normally takes 2 to 3 years to go from the identification of a virus to the identification of a vaccine, producing the first vaccine that is an experimental medicine that might be an effective treatment, normally takes 2 to 3 years. In this case, it took 2 to 3 months. From the time, you'll remember that in January, this vaccine didn't have, this virus didn't have a name. And in March, we were beginning to advance the first vaccines into clinical studies. Why? Because of the advances in sequencing technology. We were able to isolate, identify, and sequence the RNA, this is an RNA virus, of this virus very quickly, in a matter of a couple of weeks, literally, from the time the virus was first isolated. And translating from that viral RNA to vaccines also happened at light speed. and the reason for that is that the capability for doing that is retained, is present in the expertise and the experience within the pharmaceutical industry. So a number of companies, arguably, particularly 6 to 7 of these companies that are masters at producing vaccines, had that capability to translate that basic information of what's the sequence, what's the virus, into a viable vaccine in an incredibly short period of time. And that's a wonderful thing. The other place that a lot of time was saved, if you look up at the top bar, you see scale-up manufacturing, you see full-scale manufacturing, all things that are happening after there has been proof of efficacy and demonstration of safety in large phase 3 trials. In this instance, that work is being done in parallel. And I want to emphasize that this is part of that collaboration and part of that risk-taking that Sharon described as well. So before the companies that are pursuing coronavirus vaccines even know their vaccine is effective and safe, before they've completed their phase 3 studies, they are scaling up and manufacturing literally the hundreds of millions of doses that will be needed of these vaccines at risk, at their cost. And so saving a tremendous amount of time on the back end of being able to deliver a vaccine into the marketplace virtually immediately after it receives the necessary approvals. And I think I can say with confidence that it will be literally a number of days, if not hours, after approvals are received and the time when those vaccines start to become available. Next slide. So hopefully that answered questions on how we were able to go so fast this time. And notice, I won't go back to the previous slide, but I'll just emphasize, notice that that duration, the size of phase 3 didn't change between the two figures. So we're still looking, in the top figure, we're looking at 30 to 50,000 patients to really make sure we understand the effects of the potential vaccine, of the experimental vaccine in human subjects, and that we also have done a good job of describing how it works, its effectiveness in human with human data. Those same numbers you're seeing and hearing, I'm sure, through the media, 30,000 patients, 30,000 subjects, and not patients, with vaccine studies are being recruited into these studies and are being identified as participants to help create the database to build up the confidence on the efficacy and safety with these viruses. So we're not cutting corners in terms of the numbers of patients that are being exposed in clinical trial work. We're not cutting corners in terms of the volume of safety information that we will have. These studies, importantly, will not run the full length of time that you might ordinarily conduct the study for a year or 2 years to make sure you see long-term effects. These studies will run for that duration of time, but I suspect the first data that we'll see out of the studies will be earlier than that. It'll be in the 3 to 6 month time frame, when you can establish in that amount of time, is it working? Meaning, do patients who received the vaccine not go on to have the disease at the same frequency as those patients who did not receive the vaccine? So is it working? Is it effective? And second, is it safe? That first 3 month period will be critical for that. How do we get from an approved vaccine into the marketplace? Vaccines go through an advisory process. So in usual terms, there's an advisory committee potentially held through the FDA as part of the approval process. There's another advisory committee that resides under the CDC that's called the ACIP advisory committee that determines how that new vaccine should be used in commerce and in medicine. In this case, the COVID vaccines are going to be reviewed by a special panel of experts. There's actually like 60 people on this panel that's been convened by the National Academy of Medicine at the request of NIH. So what we've done is we've consolidated that review process by experts. It's also going to make it much more visible. So these experts will get together, and in fact already have. They will take input, and there are representatives on this panel from the CDC Advisory Committee, and that group together will make the recommendations that we should be hearing about actually any day now. They said they would have them complete by the end of August, their first draft, so watch for those. And that draft will be that first attempt at describing how they should be distributed, who should receive the vaccines first, and what will be the process for access. Next slide. All right, so now we've gone from developing a vaccine to getting it approved to going through the review process to make sure it's used appropriately and access goes to the patients that need it the most. How do we monitor safety once a product is out there? And this is incredibly important because remember, vaccines are given to patients who are otherwise healthy. It's not a product that's being given to sick patients. It's a product that's given to otherwise healthy people. So safety is a premium. You really have to understand the product. You have to understand its performance. You have to understand its safety. There are a number of tracking systems, and I'll say without any reserve that the tracking systems for vaccine safety in the U.S. are the finest anywhere in the world. These tracking systems allow both sponsors, so companies who understand their product better than anyone, and government agencies to track the response and the effectiveness and the safety of vaccines in real time. The first of these is called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. These are reports that are typically generated by hospitals and physicians anytime they see anything that might be, and that's important, and even if it's possibly associated with the administration of the vaccine, it gets entered into this system as a potential adverse reported event. The second is the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a way to connect all of the information that's being gathered across the country. There are state-by-state nodes for this safety data link, and it allows both input and communication back on vaccine safety extremely rapidly. So something that's very important in communication in both directions. And finally, the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Project, which is a way to track who's getting it and what the effect has been. So very important, not only, as you've heard, the importance of tracking the disease itself using testing, it's also very important to track the use of the vaccine. Who's being given the vaccine, where are they being given the vaccine, and how is that affecting the course of the disease? So that's tracked through this safety assessment and tracking process. Next slide. All right, so what's going on with COVID vaccines in particular? And again, as I said, I've never been prouder to be a part of the biopharmaceutical industry. I think the response that the industry has mounted has been incredibly fast and incredibly well coordinated. I can say firsthand that I was meeting in January of this year. Well, this was still something that was happening in China and was interesting international story, but not something that seemed to be a risk for the U.S. I was meeting with the heads of research and development of all of our member companies, the global heads, and they were formulating their plans for response at that point in time, way ahead of the curve. Nobody had to ask the industry to do this. I want to make sure that's understood. This is not something that came out of Project Warp Speed. This is something that went into Project Warp Speed, coming from the industry. So next slide. What have we got in the portfolio? This is really good news. You heard Sharon use the term shots on goal. One of the most important things, if you really need a new treatment, a new medication, is that you have multiple ways of trying to treat that disease. And in this case, we have no fewer than arguably 7 different approaches being taken to creating these new vaccines. I won't go through all of these in detail, though I'm happy to in question and answer. But recognize that these different approaches include familiar approaches that have been used for many, many years, for decades, such as inactivated virus and viral vectors, and much newer approaches like an RNA vaccine or a protein subunit vaccine. Next slide. Here's a sort of a high-level snapshot of the portfolio. There's about 170, and every time I say that number, it's wrong because it changes daily. So it's about 170 vaccines in preclinical testing. This is the earliest stage of testing where they understand in animal models and in laboratory models whether the vaccine is showing the right properties. As the pharmacologist in me would say, does it work? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? In early clinical testing, phase 1 and 2, we have 24 vaccines. You know, again, we're 6 months out from even understanding what this virus was. So it's phenomenal. Those 24 vaccines are going through the earliest stages of clinical testing, asking very simple questions. Do you see evidence of an antibody response? Do you see evidence of short-term safety in a relatively small number of patients? If the answers to those questions is yes, then vaccines advance to phase 3 testing. And right now we have 7 vaccines in phase 3 testing from 4 different categories, 4 different types. So we have a large number of vaccines being advanced. We have vaccines being advanced through a number of different approaches, different categories, different types of vaccines. So that gives us a large number of shots on goal. The more shots on goal we get, the more shots in goal we get. And as I like to say, the more shots in goal, the more shots in arms, which is what we all ultimately are looking for. Next slide. This is a landscape, and it's relatively current, of where we are with the leading vaccines today. And as you can see, and very proud, again, as a member of pharma and as a member of pharmaceutical industry, you see the prominence of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry displayed on this slide. Way out front, we have a series of vaccines, notably one being advanced from Moderna that you've heard about, I'm sure, another being advanced from Pfizer that was selected from 4 that they took through early testing, another being advanced by AstraZeneca that they have worked on in partnership with University of Oxford in England. A little further back, you have efforts from Inovio, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson. These are taking different approaches than the approaches taken by the first 3 vaccines. They're also moving very rapidly. Other companies that we know are very skilled at identifying and developing vaccines, that know how to manufacture them at large scale, such as Merck and Sanofi and GSK, are also in this game, and you see them represented in a slightly earlier part of the process. Next slide. So if we look across those different types of vaccines and we ask some simple questions like, well, how are they administered? Or, you know, how long is it going to take to get one? Or how easy are they to manufacture? We try to capture some of those concepts on this table. So, for example, an RNA vaccine is a vaccine that is composed of a strand of nucleic acid, ribonucleic acid RNA that mimics a coding region of the genetic material from the virus. And that RNA mimic is wrapped in a lipid layer, a lipid cover, and that becomes the vaccine that's injected. That vaccine then allows that RNA to use the machinery of your own cells, just like the virus would, to make copies of those proteins, those trigger proteins that your immune system can recognize. And then your immune system produces a response. We saw in the early studies with the first 2 RNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna that they did produce a robust antibody response. And interestingly, they also produced a cellular response. So without getting into too much immunology, because nobody really understands immunology, and I've been studying it for 30 years, the presence of antibodies shows that you have what they call a humoral or a rapid response. But it's the presence of those activated cells, those specialized T cells. That's where the memory comes in. And that's what was really exciting about the data to me, is that this is producing the type of immunity that could arguably or should be durable, because you're seeing the presence of those specialized T cells in sampling. So it can reach development very quickly. It can go through development relatively quickly, and manufacturing can be done at good scale for those RNA vaccines. And looking at the 5 or 6 that are out front, I suspect that one of the RNA vaccines will be one of the first ones to be available for use in the marketplace. Some of the other ones that are more familiar, such as an inactivated virus. So you take the virus, you inactivate it so it can't produce and cause a disease, but yet it's able to introduce and replicate that target, that trigger protein. That's a very traditional approach for vaccines. It typically is 1 dose followed by a booster. It is a familiar and well-established platform. Many vaccines have been approved and used for years with that approach. But it takes a while to get, as you saw with Johnson & Johnson and Sanofi, for example, on the previous slide. It takes a while for those types of vaccines to get to development. They're longer, their manufacture, their initial research takes longer. And then manufacturing, on the other hand, we know how to do, because there have been those products. So those can be manufactured at extremely high scale. And again, we're looking at products that are going to be manufactured at the hundreds of millions of doses levels. So manufacturing is an important consideration. And next slide. I think that's it. I'm going to turn it back over to Sharon, and I'll be happy to take questions once we get to the question and answer break.
Thank you, Jim. I learn every time I hear you talk about this, and it's nice that you have such a deep, rich science background, but you make it so very understandable. I appreciate that. Next slide, we want to end with giving you, as legislators and policy folks, understanding of the resources that we have. We know that during this time of the pandemic, folks are losing their jobs. They are losing their insurance coverage because of employment loss, and they need access to their medicines more than ever. We have a tool called the Medication Assistance Tool, which is a website, and it's a one-stop shopping site where it compiles over 950 public and private programs that offer free or nearly free medicines. And as a nurse, I've had a lot of my family members and even friends ask and say, we have 8 different medicines, all by different manufacturers. Is there a cheaper way to get these medicines? I have insurance, just not enough. Or maybe they don't have insurance. And this is exactly a resource that can help. And this is even more important to mention that several of our companies, all of our companies who participate with this resource, medicationassistanceTool.org, have increased their programs. Many of them have expanded the eligibility and affordability requirements. So please remember this, if you remember nothing else, for friends, families, and your constituents that you serve and do such a great job in being public officials. Please remember this as a tool that can offer free or nearly free medicines that will be shipped to their home or to their healthcare provider office. Next slide ends with talking about Pharma and Healthcare Ready, a partnership that we so happily joined after the devastating Hurricane Katrina, when folks did not have physical doctor's offices to go to, pharmacies were shut. They had no evidence to show that they were insulin patients who needed insulin. They didn't have medical records tied to anything. And this Healthcare Ready is a third party funded by multiple people, not just our industry. American Red Cross, Hospital Association, health plans are a part of it. Everybody's working to get constituents in time of need like this pandemic or natural disasters access to medicines and access to healthcare providers. Another really important resource that would like to point your attention to if you haven't seen it. Some examples of requests they've received are not just PPE equipment, but medical supplies and then assistance in filling their prescriptions. Finally, they do offer an interesting site on the next, and that is our last slide, I believe, which does show RX Open. It's basically a website that says, where are the pharmacies in your community that are actually open when there is a disaster-stricken area or a pandemic that might shut down a lot of our mom and pop shops? How do you find that pharmacy to fill your medicine when they're closed? Where are they open? Where are they available? We also have, it's a nice little pocket. Every one of us, as a former ER nurse, I always tell my friends and family to have a wallet card or something in your purse. So should you be found or need emergency assistance, that it has a list of your allergies, the medications you take, the dosages, which is important not just in times of emergency care, but those to have for coordination of care. And the coordination of the resource hub is our final piece, where there are resources for patients that talk about emergency orders that have allowed a relaxed scope of practices, where pharmacists are now, for example, able to immunize children in all 50 states as of just a week ago in all 50 states, and other things that will help. But this brings us to our conclusion. I want to thank you guys. I really want to thank Representative Schultz and Representative Lundgren for allowing Jim and I to present, and we will hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to thank Ms. Lamperton and Mr. Main for their presentation, and just turn it over to John and Laura to see if we have time for questions, or if there are any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We do have one question that that's come in so far, and that addresses question of, can you address the question of federal funding for COVID-19 vaccine research? You know, has the what sort of resources is the federal government committed not only to the federal funding research, but you know, to the companies that are looking into the vaccines, but also to whatever additional companies are going to be part of the research and distribution pipeline, you know, funding for getting, you know, getting distribution ready for the development and approval of a vaccine.
Jim?
Sharon, would you like me to start with that?
Please, thanks, Jim.
Okay. And if you remember the slide, I don't know that we need to call it back up, but you remember the slide with the timing of the various vaccines associated with the different companies. I'll use two examples from that slide because they sort of highlight this range of how federal money is being applied. And that's the vaccines from Moderna and from Pfizer. The Pfizer vaccine was identified through research, went through early testing and into phase 3 testing with no funding whatsoever from the federal government. That was entirely funded through Pfizer investment and including that early manufacturing that I described. So that's an example where there really wasn't any federal funding. And it's interesting when the CEO of Pfizer was asked, well, why didn't you seek or take federal funding when the other companies did? His answer was quite simple. He said, we didn't want to risk having to slow down. On the other hand, Moderna, a much smaller company than Pfizer, working on what will hopefully be its first product, needed additional support for getting that rapid research and development started. they partnered early on with the NIH to bring their vaccine forward and get it into initial clinical studies. My understanding is that the amount of funding that they've received is on the order of around $50 to $60 million, which I need to point out is a fraction of the total investment that it takes to bring a vaccine from concept to product. So when we see in the press, or when we hear that a company has received funding from the federal government for a vaccine, you need to remember that they're not funding the entire program, the entire R&D, they're funding a fraction of it. Now, the other type of funding that we've seen is this sort of signing up for supply that the government has been doing, the US government and other governments. And that is basically putting a place in line to say, hey, we would like to reserve the following amount of doses of your product if your product is successful and makes it to the marketplace. So that's a different type of money. It's obviously not funding. That is the type of money that is actually purchasing supplies and making those supplies available. And those agreements that you've seen announced in the press with multiple companies over time and the federal government, including both Moderna and Pfizer, are that different type of funding, that different type of support, where they're basically buying product in advance. I hope that helps, and Sharon or others, please feel free to elaborate.
I think you answered better than I would on that. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think if we have no other questions at the moment, let's go ahead and move on. So Representative Lundgren, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have one more that I wanted to try to get to here.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. The question is, it may be premature, but are the industries working with insurance groups to cover vaccines when they are ready?
It's a really interesting question. It's a little out of my area of expertise, but my understanding is that at the patient end, a lot of these vaccines will be made available at little or no cost, and that's a function of the pandemic. So while the insurance industry has been engaged, I've not seen, frankly, that type of funding activity through the insurance industry. I think as the products emerge, as they get through that initial wave of distribution, we'll see the engagement of the insurance industry in a more traditional way. But right now, because of the premium on speed of distribution and the magnitude of the challenge, I think it's being handled more centrally.
Agreed.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we're ready to move on then. So Representative Lundgren, if you'd like to take it from here.
Excellent. So our next part of our presentation today will include presentations from the Minnesota Department of Public Health. And we have Lindsay Kruger, a registered nurse who is the director of the Office of Health Facility Complaints and the current program manager for the Home Care and Assisted Living program. She oversees maltreatment investigations and state-only survey work within the Health Regulation Division. She also holds positions as a special investigator and supervisor. Since April of 2020, Lindsay has helped lead MDH's COVID-19 response for long-term care. We also today have Diane Rydrick, who is the director of the MDH Health Policy Division, which provides policymakers and other stakeholders with data and analysis and implements programs and reforms to monitor and improve healthcare market trends, value, quality, and accessibility. It also manages the statewide vital record system for birth and death records, provides leadership for electronic health exchange standards, and regulates health maintenance organization products offered in Minnesota. She has been deployed to support MDH's statewide COVID-19 response since April, helping to lead the team that is implementing expanding testing in long-term care facilities as part of the statewide Emergency Operations Center's testing team. And last, we have Karen Martin, who's a senior epidemiologist in MDH's Infectious Disease Division and she has managed influenza and respiratory surveillance for over 15 years, with a focus on national and international surveillance program evaluation. Since March, Karen has coordinated COVID-19 surveillance in Minnesota's long-term care facilities. Welcome, ladies, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Representative Lundgren. And thank you, everybody, for your participation today and for inviting us to present on Minnesota's long-term care COVID-19 response to protect our most vulnerable adults and children. So we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. So we know that COVID-19 is a deadly disease, and even more so for those residing in long-term care facilities such as nursing homes and assisted living type facilities. There are three areas to remember when we think about these settings. First of all, the residents in these settings are older, have more underlying medical conditions, and are more vulnerable to contracting COVID-19 than the overall population. Secondly, age is not the only risk factor in long-term care settings. Space is another factor as well. Residents may reside in rooms with double occupancy and may share a bathroom with one or several others and participate in group activities or dining. This space leads to closer contact with more people. And finally, another challenge in long-term care is staffing. It's not a new challenge. Prior to COVID-19, there were pre-existing staffing challenges in the industry already. Next slide, please. So to give a look at Minnesota's data that was just recently pulled for this presentation, you can see a breakdown in numbers for assisted living type facilities and nursing home facilities. 29% of Minnesota's assisted living type facilities have had a COVID-19 outbreak. Right now, only 12% are considered to have an active outbreak, meaning cases in the past 28 days. And we have 88% of these assisted living type settings who do not have active cases, meaning no cases in the past 28 days or no cases at all. For nursing home facilities, 60% have had a COVID outbreak, and currently only 31% have a case in the past 28 days. 69% of our nursing homes in Minnesota have not had any COVID-19 cases in the past 28 days, or no cases at all. Next slide, please. So the reality is in Minnesota that residents in long-term care facilities account for less than 1% of Minnesota's population, 7% of Minnesota's COVID-19 cases, but 74% of Minnesota's COVID-19 deaths. And from CMS data put out after August 9th, Minnesota ranks currently 37th nationally for average cases per 1,000 residents and 33rd for resident average deaths per 1,000 residents. So something that's being seen in other states and not only in Minnesota as well. Next slide, please. So we do know from the data in Minnesota that COVID-19 is not hitting all long-term care facilities equally. 6 in 10 nursing homes have had COVID-19 cases, but only 3 in 10 assisted living facilities have ever had a case. We feel one big factor in these numbers is space, as I mentioned above or mentioned earlier, and many more assisted living residents have their own space without shared rooms or bathrooms. They also may need less assistance from staff for their assistance with activities of daily living, among other factors. We also know that most facilities have only 1 or 2 cases, which means that they did a great job of identifying early on the case and had proper infection control practices. And we do have Karen Martin on the phone, and she can go into more data if anybody has specific questions on data. Next slide, please. So we have been working hard to help facilities not only with COVID-19 response, but in ways of prevention and preparation as well. Minnesota does hold weekly briefing calls with long-term care facilities to share the latest updates and guidance. We also hold other training sessions on various topics, including testing and visitation guidance, not only for facilities, but for public health and others as well. When there is a case confirmed at a facility, we do have a response team assigned to help with infection prevention, case interviews, contact tracing, and any other questions the facility may have. This response team includes a case manager to help assist the facility and coordinates communication with local public health, regional healthcare coalitions, the Ombudsman's office, and others for support to the facility. If there is a situation that is critical, we work to get extra help for immediate crises and plan on best next steps. Next slide, please. So Governor Walz introduced Minnesota's 5-point battle plan in May of this year for long-term care settings. These 5 pillars are ways to help provide support during this time in the best attempts to minimize the spread of COVID-19 in the long-term care settings. The 5 pillars include expanded testing for residents and healthcare workers in long-term care facilities, and secondly, to provide testing support and troubleshooting to streamline the testing process. Making sure that facilities have the adequate PPE that they need is another pillar. Fourthly, helping to provide assistance for low staffing levels for even the hardest hit facilities. And finally, working to leverage our partnerships with local public health and others to apply their skills to work together the best that we can during this time. And I'm going to turn it over to Diane now to dig deeper into these 5 pillar areas. Diane?
Thanks, Lindsay. So this is Diane Rydrick, and I'll just echo Lindsay's comments, thanking this group for having us here today. It's always, we always appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing and hope that it's helpful to other states. And we appreciate the leadership of all of you who are on this call in your roles as state legislators, really helping to ensure that we are approaching this unprecedented situation with the best science. If you could move to the next slide.
Sorry, Diane, we're having trouble hearing you.
Okay, is this any better?
Not really. You're very faint.
Oh goodness, this is the same setup and laptop as we tested yesterday.
Okay, yeah, you just got loud for a moment, and it sounded like you faded back.
I'm leaning into it as much as I can. So those of you who are seeing the video are probably going to have quite a close-up of my face. Is it better if I just speak more loud? Just try and talk loud?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, give it a, yeah, try just speaking a little more loudly. We can hear, you're kind of fading in and out.
Huh, okay. Well, I will try and project as much as I can, and I'm leaning way into the microphone, so hopefully that helps. Move to the next slide. So, foundational to our ability to attain testing, battle plan that Lindsay mentioned, the governor's office had announced what we call the testing moonshot. 1,000 tests a day statewide for a wide range of priority populations. That really seemed inconceivable. We were averaging 3,000 to 4,000 tests a day. That testing moonshot really clearly set the tone that populations, both residents and staff who support them, were going to be a very high priority for the administration. And we were going to focus a lot of resources around that population. That groundwork that was laid in April also allowed us to start building infrastructure to connect facility to labs, and make sure that labs were communicating well with each other about where capacity was available, and really coordinating that. There's almost an air traffic control type function that happens behind the scenes. I think the other foundational bit of information to think about when you think about testing in long-term care is that testing is not an end in itself. We have tried to always clearly articulate, even though there's a lot of focus on testing, it is part of a broader strategy that in long-term care includes strong infection control measures, clear and consistent staff who are symptomatic, positive to minimize spread, consistent and effective use of PPE, and I think really importantly, a shared understanding of the need to outside of the facility and community settings, particularly for staff who might be working in multiple facilities. But testing is a critical piece of that broader approach, and it has to be based on evidence. battle plan was to have a clear set of guidance for long-term care facilities on when, how, and whom to test. So MDH released testing guidance in early May that laid out clear criteria for long-term care facilities on when to test. And I won't get into the details of it too much. I'm not that technologist, but I will say, in short, anytime there is a resident or a staff member in a long-term care facility who is positive, or more than one person, resident or staff, who has symptoms that are consistent with COVID, the facility should test all residents and staff. And then
Hey, Diane.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we're really having a hard time hearing you, and it seems like it's your computer because it's going in and out.
Okay. Should I try it? So yesterday headphones did not work well. Maybe we can try that again and see if that helps.
Let's try that. And if you're really having trouble, I think either Lindsay or I could help out for the next rest of the slides. But let's try that first.
All right. Is this any better? Do the headphones help at all? Hello. Are you able to hear me any better now? Are you able to hear me at all now?
I heard you come in and then you went out again. I don't know. Lindsay, how about you? Can you hear her?
Diane, try one more time and let's see if we can hear. If not, then maybe Karen or Lindsay can take over.
Okay. I'm trying right now with headphones.
No, you went really low again.
Oh goodness. I don't know what to say. This is the same stuff as yesterday.
It's okay, Diane. Karen, do you want to go through the testing piece and then I can take it on when we get to PPE?
Sure. All right, just hoping everyone can hear me. I've been on the other side of the technical difficulties as well, so I totally understand, Diane. Thank you. The point one is expanded testing. And the first part of that is that we worked to develop some testing criteria and some processes for facilities to follow and request testing services if this was needed. So we have worked with the Minnesota National Guard, collaborated with health systems, physician services, and other private entities to really boost Minnesota's capacity for testing. We've contacted with health systems for additional testing capacity to ensure that we could reach the 20,000 per day, or the governor's moonshot for testing capacity. This was also quite a learning process for us, but we are in the midst of developing a process for transitioning away from using National Guard for swabbing. And for us to be able to sustain our efforts for testing through our partnerships with other health entities, physician services, so that we are not completely reliant on the National Guard and are transitioning away from that. We also have planning to support facilities that may be subject to new federal requirements for staff testing. I think many of you are aware of the upcoming CMS guidance that may include required testing for staff based on the prevalence of disease in a community. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we needed to do to provide testing and support and troubleshooting was to remove some of the barriers to testing and help streamline the process. So facilities have access to a range of testing resources and materials, including sample consent forms, registration and insurance forms, checklists, toolkits, and frequently asked questions. In the beginning, one of the major issues was facilities that did not have a medical director or have access to an ordering physician. And so one of the things that we worked on was creating a standing order from our state epidemiologist and working with some support to report out results and have medical consultations so that facilities who did not have a medical director could be able to order the tests that were needed without delay. And we've also had partnerships with Mayo Clinic and the University of Minnesota to help streamline the billing process and guidance. And we've implemented a nurse triage line to help provide test results and information on COVID symptoms, and using that in coordination with the standing order from our state epidemiologists to help streamline the process. Next slide. And for this, I'll hand it over to Lindsay to talk about PPE.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, so for Minnesota, we have done a number of different things to make sure that the facilities do have adequate PPE as needed right now. So we have developed a system for prioritizing and dispersing personal protective equipment to the long-term care facilities. We do have a form set up that a facility can fill out a survey, and they can indicate where they are in need of PPE supplies. And then our State Emergency Operations Center does help with supplying facilities the supplies that they are in need of within a window. We're asking for the facilities to let us know around 5 to 7 days if they are getting short on PPE, and then we work with them to get them the necessary PPE that they need. We have also distributed pulse oximeters to long-term care facilities that submitted requests. And then, like I mentioned, provided an emergency response system with emergency supply of PPE for long-term care. We're also working to proactively push out PPE supplies to facilities, knowing that CMS and the federal government has supplied some proactive pushes for long-term care in nursing homes specifically, but looking at assisted living facilities and others, and knowing that nursing homes may still need PPE in addition to that supply. So working on getting them to set up a chain of ordering their PPE and not relying on the state emergency supply as their PPE source, but moving along and helping with that. And so it looks like Diane is by phone now. So Diane, do you have anything else to add on PPE? I'll turn it back over to you.
No, thank you. And hopefully you can hear me
yes.
this way with my phone.
Much better.
Oh, good. Well, the third time is the charm. No, you made the same points that I would on PPE. And if you'd like me to take over for the last slide or two, I am happy to jump back in.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so then let's move. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So as part of the Statewide Emergency Operations Center, which is where a lot of our long-term care testing work happens and where our overall testing work group lives, we have contracted with a vendor who runs a staffing base, a staffing database. It's called AladTech. We realized early on, as Lindsay noted, staffing shortages have been an ongoing concern in long-term care facilities long before COVID came around. And what we saw very early on in the pandemic was that there were a lot of facilities that were worried about testing because they might already be having problems finding the staff that they needed. They might already be dealing with anxiety from their staff. They might be dealing with staff who had been exposed and needed to be away from work or who had tested positive. And so that was leading some of them to avoid doing some of the testing that they might otherwise need or want to do. It also often drives when facilities want to do testing, because at certain days of the week, if you find out that someone's positive, it can be more challenging to find staff at that time to step in. So the AladTech database is a really critical piece of that. It allows facilities that are coming up on or concerned about a staffing crisis to find individuals who would be able to come in and work, whether it's for a shift or for a longer period. The long-term care facility pays the salary for those individuals, but this is almost like a clearinghouse that allows them to find those people who are willing and able to work in a long-term care facility that's really struggling to find staff. We do encourage facilities to try local solutions first. As part of their preparedness plan, they should have a staffing plan. They should be monitoring their staffing. They should have kind of a first line of defense for what they're going to do if they are worried about a pending staffing crisis. So we want them to it's almost concentric circles. We want them to start working locally and then to work with their regional coalitions where possible to find staff to fill those roles. But if they are unable to, then we do have those statewide resources through the SEOC to support them with that. We also have staff within the agency and at the Statewide Emergency Operations Center, SEOC, who serve as crisis staffing supports, almost sort of a case manager model, and they provide TA to facilities to support them in working through those options for meeting their staffing needs. What that does for us is helps us know when a facility is starting to experience some challenges, when we think they're going to be reaching out for help. It's almost a bit of an early warning system so that we're able to provide them with that support before they get to a crisis phase. Usually but not always, when a facility is getting to a point of staffing crisis, we've known already that something was happening there and that they were going in that direction. And so that's important for us to really be able to support them most effectively. Next slide. Sorry, I'm not able to see the slides anymore, so I'm just going to assume we're on the regional partnerships one. So one of the things that we've also really worked on in the last few months is shifting away from a really wholly state health department centric system to one where we are drawing on local and regional resources and partnerships to the greatest extent that we can. We work very closely with local public health in implementing this overall battle plan. Local public health serves as liaisons on site when facilities are doing testing. They provide consultation and some case management support at a local and regional basis for long-term care facilities. They serve as kind of a finger on the pulse of the community for us. So they are often in touch with facilities in their communities in just a different way than we are in our case management and regulatory roles. And so if there are concerns or questions or challenges that facilities are having, they're a really important connection point for us back to these facilities. And they help us know when there are issues or problems or pending crises, and they're important partners in that effort, helping us to problem solve and make connections. We also work really closely with regional healthcare coalitions, which are a group that includes hospitals and health systems within different regions of the state, EMS, emergency preparedness, and local public health staff. Those regional coalitions convene regularly within their region to just try and understand what's happening and to stay connected to needs and resources, not just for long-term care, but more broadly. And then the different regional coalitions from each of Minnesota's regions come together very regularly and have been throughout the pandemic to look at how to coordinate resources and share information across regions. So some of the members of those regional coalition teams partner with long-term care to carry out testing. Often nursing homes or assisted living facilities will have a relationship with a hospital or a health system in their region who can help them with specimen collection, who has an in-house lab that they can use for their testing, et cetera. Many of the health systems have a process in place through which they can provide that local or regional crisis staffing support if a facility needs it, which is, again, kind of a helpful step before someone gets to the statewide staffing solutions that are available. Some of those regional partners also help to train long-term care facilities in effective PPE use, in infection control, and in specimen collection. So it really helps us to not only expand our reach at the state level and expand our ability to partner with these organizations, but it I think allows us to build on relationships that are already in place within a community and connections that are already there. And if it can be solved at that level, that's all the better. It allows us to focus our resources within the SEOC on places where that network is not as effectively in place. We can go to the next slide. So just a little bit of information about how far we've come since the battle plan was implemented. So since the time that was in place, this is our most recent data from August 24th. We have had nearly 8,000 positive cases in skilled nursing, assisted living, memory care, and hospice facilities. As Lindsay noted earlier, we currently have within that subset around 700 facilities that have had a positive case, and we track the daily change. This is a part of a daily dashboard that goes to the governor's office each morning. one of the things that I think is important to note here are the metrics of controlled facilities and stable facilities. The controlled facilities are facilities that have not had a case within a week, and the stable facilities are those that have not had a case within 4 weeks. And so, reverse that. So we want to track that because it's a good metric of how well organizations are able to control spread within their facility once they've had a positive case. We also track high growth facilities, which are those that have had an increase of 20 or more cases from 1 week ago. So if you look down in the middle of the chart, you can see how we've been tracking that over time. Both the stable and controlled facilities have been pretty consistent at just over around 50 to 60% usually in the controlled facilities, and 80 to 90% stable facilities over the last couple months. Through the work we've done doing specimen collection in long-term care using the National Guard and using health system and staffing company partners, we have to date done specimen collection in about 550 facilities. Those are unique facilities. The total number of people who have had a swab taken or a specimen collected is over 100,000. That is not a unique number though, because as you note in our guidance, often there is a need for repeat testing of negatives in a facility. And so the number of individuals includes some duplicates of people who had to be tested multiple times, but the number of facilities is a unique number. Next slide. So we are tracking quite a few different metrics just to make sure that we are meeting the goals that we set out for ourselves when we launched the battle plan in early May. We do look at some of the metrics that I just noted on our daily dashboard, looking at how well facilities are able to maintain low numbers of positive cases after they first have an outbreak or after the first case is identified. We look at the number of positive tests per day by resident and staff within these facilities, and the proportion of tests that are positive within those facilities. We are tracking the amount of support and the number of facilities we're providing support to in terms of infection control, infection prevention support that we provide through our case managers and our IPC staff. And we've been working closely even before the battle plan was launched to make sure that facilities are doing their own planning, that they have preparedness plans, that they have testing plans, that they have a plan for how they're going to deal with staffing crises when they come. Having that plan in place is really critical, and that was a heavy lift even before the battle plan was launched, to make sure that they were doing the necessary planning to be able to be ready for this when it came. Next slide. So this is a link to just a few of the resources that are available on our website. As Karen noted in her discussion of our testing approach, we have developed many resources for facilities to use, and they are generally publicly available for any organization who wants them, although they are unique to Minnesota's processes and protocols. And so I think adaptable for other states who are interested in that, but would need to be modified to fit the specific circumstances and laws and guidelines in your states. The toolkits and checklists and FAQs get a lot of use. They're updated very regularly as our guidance changes. The toolkit is a wealth of information that really pulls everything together in one place. And we've also got links here to the essential caregiver guidance for long-term care, which was announced probably close to a month ago now, or around a month ago. And then the more recently released activities and visitation guidance, which will be effective in just a few days, but which was released a couple of weeks ago to give facilities a chance to plan. We do anticipate that the demands for testing support will really increase as more facilities begin to plan to move towards level 2 on activities and visitation. And as Karen noted, when CMS makes effective their rule requiring weekly or sometimes more often testing of all staff in skilled nursing facilities, we've spent a lot of time building infrastructure to make sure we can connect facilities to testing and give them the supports they need and work through the kinks and address the barriers they're experiencing. And I think this will be the point when some of that gets tested. I think it also will be kind kind of a proving point for how well we've done in preparing facilities to do some of this on their own, whether it's training their own staff to do specimen collection, helping them make their own connections to labs, providing support, and in some cases financial support to them to be able to do this more independently. So I think this will be a point where we'll see how much that has paid off, and I think that'll be really interesting. So we'll just end it there, and I think there's still a little bit of time for questions. And thank you to Karen and Lindsay for jumping in for the technical difficulties section.
Well,
No
thank you,
problem.
Lindsay and Diane and Karen and Sharon and Jim for your thoughtful comments today. And we have a little bit of time left. I know we're kind of planning on being done about 11:30, so we've got a few minutes yet if we have some questions, Laura or John.
Sorry, we did have one question in the chat, and this was to the folks from the Minnesota Department of Health. And sorry, I just got to scroll down to scroll up to it. Yeah, the question was, can you explain if and how you are using co-visitation policies in your long-term care facilities to reduce the risk of COVID transmission?
So this is Lindsay. I can start with that question and invite Karen and Diane to jump in too. So on one of the last slides that was up when Diane was speaking, we did have links for our essential caregiver guidance. So our essential caregiver guidance was released back in July, and this was released for support for the residents and not necessarily to reduce the risk of transmission of COVID, but to reduce the risk that social isolation brings on the mental health and well-being of the residents in long-term care facilities. And so the essential caregiver guidance does have specific guidance points in there indicating that's not a casual visit. It would be a visit of a caregiver that provided routine support to the residents prior to the time of COVID, and then for the facilities to work with these individuals as essential caregivers and to develop policies that they could come in to provide similar support in the fashion that they did previously. And then Diane also mentioned we do have our long-term care visitation and activities guidance that was released a couple weeks ago. It does go into effect here this coming Saturday, and the guidance was developed in correlation with looking at CMS's QSO 20-30 memo, which gives recommendations to the states to develop their own guidance. We did place in the guidance facilities can be in level 1 or level 2 based on if they've had an outbreak in the last 28 days. However, an outbreak is not the only reason that they would have restricted visitation. It includes other significant factors such as case counts in the community, PPE, staffing shortages, all things that we've already talked about and identified as concerns in long-term care. And so I hope that helps answer that question. Karen or Diane, do you have anything else to add?
I think that's great, Lindsay. And the only other thing I would add is that, and I think you did mention this, in all of our guidance, we do have, instructions on how to do these visits safely, and that facilities should be allowing these visits if they can be done safely, including having, the appropriate PPE for staff, but, masking for visitors, appropriate distance, and supervision of visits if necessary.
All right, do we have any other questions today before we kind of bounce over? We're kind of running out of time, but I know we had a roundtable planned, so I think John said we could stay on a little bit longer for those of you that have some issues that you want to discuss. If you need to go, we understand. We appreciate your participating today, but is there any other questions for our last presenters? This is not usually a silent group, so you must have done a great job with your presentations. Thank you today.
Yeah, I think it looks like.
All right, is there anybody? Oh, go ahead, John.
I'm sorry. It looks like if there are no more questions, you know, that I just want to thank everyone for their participation. Sharon and Jim from Pharma, Diane, Karen, Lindsay from Minnesota Department of Health. Thank you all for joining us in this webinar. Thank you to everyone who did join in and participate. We hope this has been informative and has given you a lot of information to digest and take back to your colleagues and your staff. And we hope that it informs you guys moving forward in these still uncertain times.